the third lesson here in Tecmo Bowl Matchmaking School, right? We're going to circle back to what we talked about in the first episode, Player 1 Advantage. Just a refresher. There is a lot to indicate that being Player 1 and having your players on the left side of the screen is a solid advantage. There are numbers, there is data to support that. We got a positive win rate. You got more points scored per game on average. So for the sake of this upcoming discussion, we're just going to agree that Player 1 is an advantage. Now we're going to tie that into what we talked about in the second lesson, even matchups, right? If I win a coin toss and I call a basically equivalent set of teams, my opponent sees that there's not a big difference between those two teams. He is going to take Player 1, right? And then I get my pick of those two teams. But if we can agree that being Player 1 is an advantage and also agree that the teams are even, then that means that the bad guy has an advantage and I don't have one, right? And if you call an even matchup against a good player in the tournament, he is going to take Player 1. Almost certainly, right? Maybe if he's got a real hard-on for Chicago and you call an elite matchup, he might take Player 2 Chicago. I've seen that happen before for sure. Personally, I like the idea of having at least a little something in my pocket, right? So either I'm Player 1 or I've got the better team, right? So how do we achieve that, right? When it comes to asymmetrical matchmaking, I want you to think of like the middle class that we discussed in the last lesson, those middle class of teams. They're like the hinge of a door, right? And sometimes that door swings this way, and you take a middle class team, and you're like, I like this matchup against an elite team. And so you challenge an elite team with a middle class team, right? And then you're going to either wind up with the better team or with Player 1. But sometimes that door swings this way, right? And you're like, okay, well, this middle class team has these weaknesses that I think I can overcome their strengths with a lower rung team, right? So the middle class, it all kind of hinges on the middle class. I wouldn't necessarily recommend taking like a lower rung, like a working poor team and challenging an elite, right? The door kind of swings from that middle class. Now, a lot of this is subjective. It really comes down to your preferences on how you like to play, right? And so I'm not, instead of like going through potential matchups, because one, I don't want to give everything away that I've been thinking about. We do have a tournament to play here in a month. But what I am going to do is I'm going to quickly run down the middle class teams. We're going to talk about some of their strengths that might allow them to play up in competition, but also touch on some of their weaknesses that might make them vulnerable to a challenge from a lesser team. All right? Let's start with Denver. I generally, in tournament play, consider them to be the fourth best team. You could make an argument for any middle-class team. Generally, I think it's Denver because Elway is so good and they have a versatile defense. Specifically, inside linebacker Carl Mecklenburg. You can use Mecklenburg to defend the run against Chicago. All right? That's big. And Mecklenburg's more than capable of riding herd on Walter Payton. On top of that, top defensive end Rulon Jones. He's not as good as Mecklenburg, but he's solid, right? He's very useful against San Fran. And then when San Fran calls the shotgun play, then you can be Mecklenburg. And Mecklenburg has the speed to defend that play as well. So Denver's pretty well suited against a couple of the elite teams. On the downside, though, Mecklenburg cannot play a useful role against New York when the door swings one way, or Dallas when it swings the other. And so what that means is that the offense can then target Rulon Jones in the run, and that makes them vulnerable. Seattle is kind of a similar use case to Denver. They have a very good back in Kurt Warner. Warner can get first downs against any defense. Top inside linebacker Fred Young is one of the best defenders in the game. He's even a little better than Mecklenburg. His use situations are the same as Mecklenburg, so you can use him against Chicago, use him against all the middle-class teams. Those guys can play a role against Miami. But like Young and Mecklenburg, cannot play a useful role, for example, against LA. All right? And also, unlike Denver, Seattle does not have any, they don't even have a Rulon Jones type. Rulon's not a great player, but he does have some initial speed. Seattle does not have any initial speed on the perimeter of their defense. It does drag them down a little bit. Your best bet on top and bottom defenders, probably bottom defensive end Jacob Green and top safety Kenny Easley. Easley has good top speed, but he starts off so slow and takes so long to get going that he's just it limits his usefulness. He's not a great defender. Now let's look at Cleveland. They've got the best secondary in the game. Hanford Dixon's one of the best defenders on Tecmo Bowl. If you've got him, you've got a fighting chance. And Frank Minifield is an outstanding complementary defender. You can gamble a lot with Cleveland, right? You can be unpredictable. The other guy's not going to know which safety to target in the run game. That's very valuable, and it definitely helps them play up. Cleveland has a great kick returner. They've got a good quarterback. Their weak run game really holds them back. In fact, if you think about, like, who are they going to be going up against if you challenge an elite team with Cleveland? Ronnie Lott, Dave Dewerson, Carl Banks, Lawrence Taylor. Those guys can all be off their block before Kevin Mack even reaches them, right? That's not a lot of fun. In fact, I seem to notice that type of play a lot this season in Tecmo Bowl Draft League. It's not a lot of fun to go against. And so that's something to keep in mind. And that's why I think Cleveland is maybe more of a candidate to be challenged by a lower-rung team rather than trying to play up with Cleveland. Last middle-class team to touch on here, Indy. They've got Dickerson. Dickerson's the man. And their pass games, depending on how you want to play it, they have very short, easy-to-complete routes, which somewhat offsets the fact that they have the worst quarterback in the game, right? Good old Jack Trudeau. The downside is they don't have a ton of speed or power on defense. They have the worst defense out of any middle-class team. They really just have Dwayne Bickett. And Bickett's a useful player. He doesn't play in a great spot. He can block like mid-range field goals according to tournament rules anyway. He's really the only one other than LT that you have to worry about that from. But I'd like him a lot more if he was in that top outside linebacker spot. He'd be a more useful player. So the downside with Indy is if you try and play up with them, yeah, you've got Dickerson, and Dickerson might be the best weapon in the Tecmo Bowl middle class, but you got that crummy defense that's kind of holding you back. Now, really, the best thing that you can do is just kind of review the rosters, review the information that's available on the Tecmo Bowl League website. Shameless plug here, right? There's a lot of good info in there. Look at the rosters. Look at what teams have speed where. Look at the information we have on how those players can be useful both as man defenders and as drone defenders. You know, how can you get computer coverage on certain pass plays? We've got all that information posted there, and I would suggest taking a look at it. The one thing I would encourage you to keep in mind with asymmetrical play calling, or matchmaking rather, is just assume that you're going to end up with the crappier team. That's the mindset you want to have, right? So you can call Dallas versus Chicago, and you'll definitely get player one, but then you've actually got to play that matchup, and that sucks. So you want to be mindful. What's the worst team that I can beat a good team with is basically how you want to look at it, right?